There's something very peculiar about the way that most works of historical fiction tend to age. Like most fiction, if it is a work of poor quality, it is quickly forgotten, with very little chance of rediscovery. Unique, however, is its ability to become emblematic of the period it is written about more than the period it was written in. It is this phenomenon which makes it so that when I watch a film like, for instance, 2019's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I remain ever so slightly unimmersed in its setting. The cinematography choices, in particular, give away the hand of a distinctly contemporary film, while Amadeus, from 1984, to my untrained eye, effortlessly draws me into the 18th century. It represents a period it does not belong to. This is the fate that, in my mind at least, has so utterly befallen Italo Calvino's 1957 novel, The Baron in the Trees, the crispness and tact of whose postmodern prose, which, upon release, surely seemed utterly distinct to the period in which it was written, now to my ear seem deliberate choices to evoke the light, order, and serenity of its late 18th century setting, as Virginia Woolf once described it in Orlando, she herself imposing an authority on the subject which is unearned but wholly deserved. What does it mean, I kept asking myself as I read, for a writer to become contemporaneous with a time other than their own? Though I have been reading snippets of Calvino for almost 5 years now, for, in my experience, his prose is best enjoyed in snippets and scenes, much like poetry, it was just last summer that I came across The Baron in the Trees, the first novel of his which I easily read straight through. Perhaps, as with almost every modernist or postmodernist writer that I've come across, his is writing that requires a kind of stamina that needs to be built up over time. And when I sat down for this one, I had accumulated enough of it. But I don't think so. The novel follows a young boy, Cosimo, who, after a dinner-time dispute with his parents, climbs into a tree and decides to never come down. As I read, I felt that it was the magnetism of the setting which so captivated me. The fields, beaches, villas, and especially the trees of the fictional valley of Ambrosia. Calvino introduces it better than I ever could. Quote, I don't know if it's true that, as you read in books, in olden days a monkey that left Rome jumping from tree to tree could reach Spain without touching the ground. In my time, the only place where the trees were so dense was the shoreline of the Gulf of Ambrosia, from one end to the other, and its valley, up to the mountain ridges, and for that reason our district was renowned everywhere. These places are no longer recognizable. First, the French came, cutting down woods as if they were fields that are reaped every year and grow back. They didn't grow back. It seemed a thing of the war, of Napoleon, of the times, but it didn't stop. The hills are bare, so that to look at them, for us who knew them before, is disturbing. At that time, wherever we went, we always had leaves and branches between us and the sky. End quote. I don't know what it takes to write something like that. A pine of the middle distance past, sandwiched between one that is ancient and one of the future, present. But it seems to me either that Calvino possessed an enormous well of nostalgia, the kind common among academics today which borders on neurasthenia, or else he was so clear-eyed about the inexorable human tendency to make bare hills where once were forests, described with just as much clarity by Plato as by David Attenborough, to be able to invent the sentimentality of his narrator, Cosimo's younger brother, Biagio. Either way, it is clear from these early descriptive passages that the trees are the setting. The trees are Ambrosia. They are the characters, the point of view, the most essential component of the novel. For some further insight into the way that Calvino so expertly puts on the costume of the 18th century in The Baron in the Trees, and why, I turn to his 1985 essay collection, 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, composed at the very end of his life. In Lightness, Calvino writes that the motivation for fantasy and escapism is as a kind of rehabilitation. Quote, whenever humanity seems condemned to heaviness, I think I should fly like Perseus into a different space. I don't mean escaping into dreams or into the irrational. I mean that I have to change my approach, look at the world from a different perspective, with a different logic and with fresh methods of cognition and verification. End quote. A fresh perspective, you say? What could better suit this purpose than to climb into the trees, revealing an entirely new world? Throughout the novel, Cosimo engages with the human world from his vantage point and invents his own. When, for instance, he devises a plan with his uncle to create an aqueduct irrigation system entirely suspended above ground through the branches of his trees, their scheme goes completely against the grain of typical human activity. The building of an aqueduct, it seems to me, is the exact kind of activity that would normally justify the felling of large swaths of forest. I am careful to avoid inserting allusions to conservation where they don't belong or where they were not intended. But a 21st century audience like myself cannot help but imagine the improvements upon the world that might be made if we considered the world more frequently from the logic and perspective of our arboreal friends. The perspective that Cosimo is granted from the trees is both enlightening and isolating. On the one hand, it becomes the basis for his entire life, the adventures he gets to go on, the relationships he forms, the lessons he learns. But as Biagio imagines, it is lonely to see things in a unique way. Quote, "He was there, not seen, in the shadow of the top of the plane tree, in the cold, and he saw the lighted windows, the known rooms festively decorated, the bewigged people dancing. What thoughts crossed his mind? Did he ever regret our life at least a little? Did he think how short was the step that separated him from a return to our world? How short and how easy? I don't know what he thought. I only know that he remained for the whole celebration, and even longer, until one by one the candles were extinguished and no window remained lighted." End quote. Does this isolation of perspective that Cosimo experiences not mirror somehow the experience of reading it, or of reading historical fiction generally? I always feel when I read it that I temporarily inhabit two worlds, not that which is real and that which is unreal, but that which is and that which used to be. This is the distinction from historical fiction which, however fantastical, inhabits a world which feels concrete, and fantasy, which is necessarily wholly synthetic and imaginary. One of the things that continues to mystify me about The Baron in the Trees, and indeed the genre of historical fiction as a whole, is this question. What is the reader supposed to feel? Is the function of historical fiction an educational one, to make us feel more informed about and connected to the past? If so, I would imagine it would be argued that first-hand accounts are a better source. Are they an exercise in nostalgia or the collectivization of popular imagination? Surely then they would have no substance beyond the period they are written for, and this seems not to be the case. Baron in the Trees, after all, was written 70 years ago. Perhaps it is a means of imposing the values and perspectives of the present onto the past. But in this case, Calvino's work is particularly vexing, as it seems to be searching for a new perspective, as we've discussed. In her 1995 essay, The Sight of Memory, Toni Morrison goes a long way, I think, in answering this question of historical fiction and its function, at least from her perspective as a writer. Quote, "I can't tell you how I felt when my father died, but I was able to write Song of Solomon and imagine not him and not his specific interior life, but the world that he inhabited and the private or interior life of the people in it. And I can't tell you how I felt reading to my grandmother while she was dying, but I could try to reconstruct the world that she lived in, and I have suspected, more often than not, that I know more than she did, that I know more than my grandfather and my grandmother did. But I also know that I'm no wiser than they were. These people are my access to me. They are my entrance to my own interior life, and they surface so vividly and so compellingly that I acknowledge them as my route to a reconstruction of a world, to an exploration of an interior life that was not written, and to the revelation of a kind of truth." End quote. In addition to painting this wonderful picture of historical fiction as an exercise in imagining the world as it once was, as a means of understanding the context of one's own life, I think the idea Morrison presents here is just as applicable to my experience as a reader of Calvino's. Because yes, while reading The Baron in the Trees, I did begin to feel like I knew more about the 18th century than someone who lived in it. I really felt like with the experience of this fantasy novel, plus the benefit of over 200 years of retrospect and historical knowledge, I had gained access to it in a way that nobody could in any other way. Of course, this isn't true, but the feeling remains. Fiction of all kinds, but especially that which is set in the past, is a route to the reconstruction of a world made all the richer because it was. In that process of reconstruction, a really powerful experience is enjoyed. That experience can feel like ownership, education, nostalgia, popular imagination, or all of the above. And in this experience, too, there lies a unique and powerful perspective. The vantage of possessing history, I guess you could call it. The experience of a kind of righteous truth which inspired the ancient Greeks to model their societies on the legends of the Trojan War, and which continues to guide and misguide Americans toward a more perfect union based on the mythologized vision of the Founding Fathers. Some of you might, at this point, think it a little bit strange that I have taken up as emblematic of the transformative truth of fiction, a book which does not even purport to be anything but a magical realist fantasy. That I have taken up as an example of historical fiction, a novel which is not trying to be very historical. Or that in this moment when it really does feel as though we are all condemned to heaviness, that I would seek escape in the fresh air of the late 18th century and its Enlightenment idealism, which by all accounts got us into this mess in the first place. A lot of it has to do, I'm sure, with the particular reading experience I had with The Baron in the Trees, sitting under the trees. Los Angeles is not known for its trees, unless you count palm trees, which I do not, but it ought to be, because in the mountains and canyons which surround it on all sides, there are some truly splendid sugar pines and oaks and sycamores. And it was under these boughs, astride of Bounding Creek, that I had the pleasure of imagining the Baron in his trees above.